Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we will be continuing to read Out of the Shadows, Reimagining Gay Men's Lives by Walt Odets. We're starting chapter 8, The Life and Times of Matthias Johnson. A day considered as a span of time, period gone through. God is my witness, Christ denied. Never shall it be said to my reproach that, for fear, I felt to leave by the door I entered. Keith Wardrop, The Not Forever. Almost from start to finish, Matthias Johnson's life was his own invention, and he would leave by the door he entered. By his own account, he was gay at the age of 6, and it is certain that he died gay at the age of 67. As a child and teenager, he survived abuse and rejection, but with support from a handful of others, he forged the life that was humanly intimate, artistically productive, and above all else, largely self-accepting and authentic. Matthias was always Matthias, a fact I can attest to, for I knew him for 50 of his 67 years. He was one of the most courageous people I have known, and it sounds too simple to say, but it is true. Matthias was gay, and he was a hero for simply being and living as himself. Born in Texas to fundamentalist parents descended from, in Matthias' telling, Dore Norwegian stock, he moved with his family to Fairbanks, Alaska, when he was 3 months old. There he was raised in an 8-foot wide, 40-foot long trailer with his older brother, Hakon, his mother and father, and his mother's beloved cat, to which Matthias was profoundly allergic. His mother, Betty, was the intellect in the family, but she was deeply disappointed in her own narrow and impoverished life, narrower than the trailer we all squeezed past each other in, and just as shabby, Matthias once told me. Betty survived on a diet of movie star and true crime magazines, and although she never admitted it, Matthias was sure that she dreamed of being Lana Turner. This fantasy conveniently included both Hollywood stardom and murder. Johnny Stompanato, Turner's gangster boyfriend, was stabbed to death by Turner's teenage daughter, Cheryl, in the master bedroom of their Beverly Hills home. For Betty, the Lana Turner fantasy was thus encompassing and complete. Matthias respectfully described his father as a dolt, whose saving grace was that he rarely opened his mouth. He would occasionally bark a reprimand or demand, but he usually forgot his purpose a moment later. Matthias' brother, Hakon, was not bright like Matthias and their mother. He was more like the dolt. Hakon was terrified of life, particularly the emotional life that lived inside him, and he took it out on Matthias. Matthias had always felt that Hakon was definitely gay, and when Hakon moved back to Texas at the age of 29, Matthias conjectured that Hakon had done it to find cowboys to fuck. Instead, or perhaps in addition to sexual pursuits, Hakon opened a fundamentalist church of his own, and the enterprise quickly became a hugely successful television ministry, broadcast throughout the Western world. As Matthias would himself become a playwright, this was clearly a family with show business in its blood, if you discount the dolt and the cat. Matthias' family was a very hostile place for a smart and precocious boy who dreamed only of other boys and realized he was gay at the age of 6. While better than poor Cheryl's childhood, Matthias' was certainly in the running. There was the cat, with which he was trapped in a trailer hardly largely enough for the cat alone, much less the 5 of them. He spent his childhood blowing his perpetually runny nose on dirty clothes from the laundry hamper because his father told Matthias he was wasting Kleenex if he used more than 2 a day. Matthias' father and Hakon mercilessly teased the obviously feminine Matthias. I have seen photographs, and he was an exceptionally delicate and beautiful child, and taunting peers in grammar in high school only made it worse. Matthias once told me that he had been beaten so many times by gangs of boys that the only thing that had saved him from multiple bone fractures was the heavy outdoor clothing he wore for the Alaskan winters. When I first met him as a 17-year-old, Matthias had a slightly crooked nose on his still beautiful face, but for me, it only added to his presence and charm. He experienced it differently. Behind the dreams of stardom and murder, Matthias's mother had a whole other hidden story. Betty was filled with shame. She had married a man from the wrong side of the tracks in Ropesville, Texas, and her parents were deeply disappointed in the direction her life was taking, and they let her know it in no uncertain terms. But it was worse than that. Betty was pregnant with Hakon before the wedding, with a hostile father, brother, and cat in the trailer, and bands of ruffians outside. As a young child, Matthias had sought companionship and solace from his mother, but got it only sporadically. She was socially very self-conscious and would clean the trailer with disinfectant, rags, and Q-tips before any visitors. All women from her fundamentalist church were allowed in. And she had a peculiar way of presenting the family to these God-fearing croonies. Betty introduced her husband and Hakon by name, and would then point to Matthias and say, "And this is our little artist." Judging by her extreme reaction when she finally realized that Matthias was gay, she had had little conscious awareness of this very obvious fact. She had always known that something was wrong, and she was as ashamed of Matthias as she was of herself, and Matthias knew it. Betty had more than shame, she had rage. In Matthias's telling, you could practically smell it in the confines of the trailer, even with a disinfectant. Without warning, she would every now and then unleash that rage on Matthias, but no one else. The little artist seemed clearly bound for something she had never allowed herself. She was envious. Matthias tried to find refuge from his living nightmare in books, writing, drawing, and painting, all of which only heightened the ignorant ire of his father and brother. Betty was secretly impressed, but never said so, because this obvious talent continually reconfirmed her feeling that Matthias was headed for something she would never have. By the time Matthias was 15, he had read all of Victor Hugo's novels, beginning with Les Miserables, which, precociously at age 10, he had retrieved from the Fairbanks library, thinking it must be a story about a family living in a trailer. By the time he was 16, he had the almost certain distinction of being the only person in Alaska who had read all 10 volumes of the Memoirs of Casanova, and he had also worked his way through the entirety of Remembrance of Things Past, most of which he had not completely understood, though he had detected that he and Proust had something important in common. In his reading, writing, painting, and drawing, Matthias had created a completely private world, a world that took him out of the trailer and into a life that survived on the dreams he would eventually follow. His English teacher at school, Hortense Twain, had a soft spot for Matthias, and she encouraged and supported him with book suggestions and small gifts of writing paper, watercolor pads, and paint sets. She was actively admiring and once told Matthias that she thought he was one of the best authors she had read since Mark Twain, who, she assured Matthias, was no personal relation to herself. Matthias, of course, already knew Mark Twain, front to back and top to bottom. One night, Matthias told his family at dinner about a compliment Miss Twain had given him for a short story he had recently finished. Matthias's father pointed at him, looked at his wife, and fairly shouted, "What's the matter with this boy? He's your son." Matthias knew exactly what his father really meant and was terrified by the apparent discovery. He flushed with embarrassment and then started to cry. "And that's just the kind of girly shit I'm talking about," his father continued, still shouting at Betty. Matthias ran to his bed at the front of the trailer, and as he rushed past, Hakon said under his breath, "It's about time you learned about pussy." Matthias lived almost entirely in his self-made private world because he had to. It was within that world that he was working feverishly on his future, whether he knew it or not. "It's what kept me alive," he much later told me. That and Hortense Twain. He kept all the fruit of his labors stacked in a cardboard book box under his bed, which was the only personal space he was allowed in the trailer. By the time he was 16, the box was ready to burst, and so was Matthias. 3 times Matthias had thought about killing himself, the first time at the age of 12. The night of his humiliation at dinner became the 4th time, 4 days after his 16th birthday on February 11, 1963. This was no empty threat or a cry for help, because Matthias knew exactly how he would do it. In the summer, the Chena River flowed right behind the family's trailer, and everyone in the neighborhood used it as a garbage dump for everything from kitchen scraps to broken lawn chairs and worn-out car tires. When the river froze during winter, it was still the dump, and the garbage would pile up, sometimes 3 or 4 feet high, before the thaw sank it or floated it down river. On the coldest possible winter night, Matthias planned to crawl out into the ice and hide under the piles of debris and freeze to death. Jack London had told him it would be euphoric and quick, and Matthias needed nothing more to recommend it. No one would find his body until the garbage, and in the thaw, he would sink or float away and be forever free of Alaska, and the horror of his family and schoolmates. Though it was plenty cold enough, Matthias did not initiate his plan the night of the humiliating dinner. He had also been considering an alternative, one based on the advice and assistance of Miss Twain. She had told Matthias that he had real talent, and that there were many possibilities in life. He did have dreams, and her ideas engaged him. Miss Twain thought Matthias would do better down in the lower 48, maybe New York, or even San Francisco, and she quietly told him that one day after class. And Miss Twain told him how he could do that after he graduated high school, and gave him a copy of the Fairbanks bus schedule, and believed that it would bolster his hope and get him through the last year at Fairbanks High. She also handed Matthias a plain, sealed envelope with his name handwritten in fountain pen ink on the front. Inside there were 7 $20 bills. "You need to pay for the bus ticket," she said, "and have a little left over to get started. It's all I can afford. I hope it's enough." Matthias thanked Miss Twain and promised he would finish school and keep the schedule and envelope in the box under his bed. But the night of the horrible dinner, one more year felt completely impossible, and Matthias realized that he had to break his promise to the only person in the world who liked him and had shown him kindness. Matthias had always been an outsider to his life, an exotic tropical bird swept into a cold, hostile landscape by a quirk of the jet stream. He was freezing to death in a hateful world of abuse, fear, humiliation, and shame. The trailer felt as if it were shrinking daily, and the wretched 19-year-old cat had still not died. After school let out for the summer preceding his senior year, and 5 months before the Kennedy assassination in Dallas, Matthias implemented Miss Twain's plan instead of his own. At 3:30 a.m. on June 6, 1963, Matthias left a brief unaddressed note on the kitchen table telling his family that he was leaving and would not be coming back, and warning them not to look for him. "If you locate me, I will never let you bring me back here, no matter what," the note concluded. And he signed it M. Under the note he placed a sealed envelope addressed to Miss Hortense Twain, for the recipient only. It was a thank you note. Then, with his duffel bag on his back and his heavy cardboard book box in his arms, Matthias trudged over an hour to the bus station, where he bought a one-way ticket to Grand Island, Nebraska. During the trudge, he had thought about Miss Twain's suggestion of New York or San Francisco, and decided that New York was farther away, and thus the better option. But Grand Island was as far as he could get on half of his $140, and that's what he settled for. He was headed in the right direction for New York, and maybe Grand Island would be grand. In the trailer the next morning, the dolt was infuriated and wanted to call the police. Matthias' mother slapped him twice in the face and said, "For once in your life, leave that goddamn boy alone." The Dold and Hakon were shocked. Betty had used the Lord's name in vain, and she was angry. When Matthias left, her dreams for herself left with him, and she would never forgive him for abandoning her. He, she realized, would have a better future. She would not. 3 days later, Matthias rolled into Grand Island, and from the bus window it didn't look grand. As it turned out, it wasn't an island at all. But Matthias was nevertheless thrilled to be so far away from Fairbanks, and even after paying for food during the trip, he still had $59 and change in his pocket, which felt like a fortune. More fortuitously than anyone could have imagined, the bus station was a short walk from the airport, and Matthias hiked over with his knapsack and box to watch the airplanes land and take off, and to find something to eat. As he sat on the bench, a handsome boy a year older than Matthias walked by, and Matthias asked him if he knew where to find food. Matthias and Mike would become friends, and Mike's family would become Matthias's own for the following year. Mike's father, Mr. Markey, owned the fixed base operation on the airport that sold fuel, serviced planes, gave flight instruction, and provided transportation and assistance to transient pilots. He offered Matthias a job as a line boy, and Matthias learned to drive a follow-me truck to lead aircraft to parking spots and refuel them. He and Mike worked on the line together. In one night shift, when there was little traffic to attend to, Mike introduced Matthias to his first sexual experience in a darkened hangar under the wing of a twin-engine Beechcraft Baron that belonged to a Nebraska Republican U.S. Senator. The blowjob was a revelation. Matthias and Mike became best friends, the first real friend Matthias had ever had, except for Miss Twain. Mr. Markey thought Matthias a good learner, a hard worker, and an upstanding young man, and, in addition to expanding his paid duties, offered him free flight instruction. Mr. Markey was a retired Navy flight instructor in F-104 starfighters, and he would personally conduct Matthias's training. He also often took Matthias home for dinner, where Mrs. Markey found that she liked him too. She was a student counselor at Nebraska University at Kearney and was uncomfortable with Matthias living in a rented room on the east edge of town. She decided the family would take him into their home. He roomed with Mike. Mrs. Markey mended his clothing and bought him some new things. And after he showed the family what was in the box, she insisted that he immediately apply to a good college and finish his last year of high school in Grand Island. She would help him with both. All the while, in the luscious privacy of their bedroom, Mike was teaching Matthias more about the human body than he had ever dreamed of. Matthias finished his year at the Markeys with a junior degree in sex education, a private pilot license with instrument rating, a high school diploma, and acceptance at Wesleyan University with a full scholarship, including room and board. Matthias had managed to save $600 from his part-time job at Mr. Markey's, $140 of which he mailed to Miss Twain at the high school address. He placed the money on an envelope, wrapping the 720s in a sheet of paper on which he wrote, "Please do not tell anyone where I am. I am fine, and I finished high school here. I'm going to college in Connecticut, which is near New York. Mrs. Markey, the mother in the family I am staying with, helped me with getting into school, and her son Mike is my best friend. Thank you for everything. From our appreciative student, Matthias." Even as the trauma of his earlier life was still alive and churning within him, Matthias now had a glimpse of the futures that Miss Twain, Hugo, Casanova, Proust, and the Markey family had suggested were actually possible. In just 1 year, Matthias had 3 new people who liked him, which made a total of 4, including Miss Twain. And anyway, Mike counted for at least 1.5. And this helped Matthias feel the dreams might not always be just dreams. His thoughts of the Chena River and Jack London's solution had slowly receded from consciousness. But inside he was still injured, haunted, and fearful, even as he was determined not to live in those feelings. He He would try to accept what the world was now offering and see if he could really be a part of it. Even with all he had endured, Matthias was strong, and it was not just the kind of strength some people use to hide their injury. It was real strength. Matthias made no effort to hide any part of his internal life. He showed his vulnerability, too. It was just not the whole story. The first week of August 1965, the entire Markey family drove 17-year-old Matthias to the bus station in the Markey Aviation Company van. Matthias said goodbye to everyone, thanked them for everything they had done for him, shook Mr. Markey's hand, then kissed Mrs. Markey on the cheek, then Mike. Mike blushed. Mr. Markey pretended not to see the kiss for Mike, but Mrs. Markey saw it, and she understood. She put one arm around Mike and the other around Matthias, and gave Matthias a second kiss and said, "I know you and Mike are going to miss each other, but sweetie, you need to make your own life. I hope it's a wonderful life, and please stay in touch so we know how you're doing." Then she kissed Matthias on the cheek again and quietly whispered in his ear, "This is from Mike." Now Matthias blushed. He boarded the bus, and once seated he waved goodbye, and all the Markeys waved back. The magic carpet to his future, and to mine, released its air brakes with a whoosh and lumbered out of the station, pointed at Connecticut. From his view, through the smeared window next to his seat, Matthias thought Mike was tearing up, but wasn't sure. On their last night in bed together, with Mike faced away from him in the dark, Matthias had said something he had learned from Casanova. "You know I'll always love you." Mike had not responded, and Matthias thought Mike was also crying then, because Matthias could feel a slight tremble in Mike's body and the mattress. "I need to go to college. I want to be a writer," Matthias pleaded. Without turning his head, Mike answered with a choked, "I know." Matthias stroked Mike's back for several minutes, and the two soon fell asleep together, resting up for the morning departure. When you're 17, you can sleep through anything.